very much to all of you for being here in this visiting professor seminar. I'm happy here to introduce you to Professor Spencer Ross. He's Associate Professor of Marketing and Manning School of Business, University of Massachusetts. He described. So I have had the great experience to share with Spencer for the last 4 months, because he has been here as part of a Fulbright scholarship. He came here the 3rd of January, and he's going to leave tomorrow. And over this time, we have study, work class, working together, doing some field work about specialty coffee and the emergent theme of inequity in the value system, which is the research that we are working right now. And so he's going to present what we have done, what we have thought, and also different.
Yes, thank you, Andres. Thank you everyone for being here today. It has definitely been a fabulous 4 months here in Colombia for me, working with Andres, getting to see everybody here, the hospitality that everybody has shown me. I may or may not make it through the end or the beginning of this, but somewhere in the middle, I'll get it together. It is kind of bittersweet saying goodbye after the 4 months. Taking off tomorrow. And of course, this being the day before, I've got my flat half packed. So more than half packed at least. So so I've been working with Andres over the last 4 months, obviously, about specialty coffee. And it was interesting when I came here that people were like, oh, this is going to be really interesting work. We need more research on this. And it's something that I just sort of assumed as an American that was already being done, in Colombia. And it seems like there's a lot of room for additional research on the industry. So I wanted to start off a little bit about background, just how I got here and sort of how I chose Colombia and working with Andres, and then we'll get into the actual core of what you're here for, the core of the talk. So a little bit about myself and how I got interested in coffee, because people have asked me that since I've been here. Why coffee? Why Colombia? Why here? Et cetera, et cetera. So I did my undergraduate at McGill in Montreal, and that was the first place that I had really sort of taken a shine to coffee culture. I minored in French, so some of you know that that was sort of my second language, and over 4 months, I think maybe Andres can attest to my Spanish being so. I don't think I could have done this whole talk in Spanish. That's for certain. After I graduated, I got really interested in Starbucks. That's Howard Schultz, CEO, founder of Starbucks. I ran into him at some event they were doing in New York City while I was working on my MBA. That was when I was interested in corporate social responsibility. Coffee was sort of my lead into CSR work and interest in CSR. But the recession hit in 2008 in the US. It was in New York and everybody got laid off. So I thought about academia, and coffee sort of took me through there as well. Coffee sort of got me into the consumer side. And while I was working on my doctoral thesis, the manager at Starbucks cut the power to the bar and I couldn't work there anymore. And I said, to heck with this. The shop opened up across the street and they served specialty coffee. And it was the first time I had ever heard of specialty coffee and what the difference was and how the taste was and what direct trade was and all of these other things. And that sort of took it to the next level for me in terms of what coffee was and how coffee could be looked at as a industry that could potentially do good in this world. Coffee is probably the most universal, ubiquitous choice that consumers make on a regular basis. I mean, there are a lot of things that we have that we need, but we're not necessarily making a conscious or habitual choice. Coffee is that thing. And there's so many avenues, whether it's ecological sustainability or social sustainability, that coffee has ties to. And that for me was very important. So as I finished my PhD, moved to the eastern side of Massachusetts, closer to Boston, where I am now, met this gentleman who is the godfather of East Coast coffee, specialty coffee. He started a business called the Coffee Connection in the 1970s. His name is George Howell. He ultimately, he sold to Starbucks in the 90s when Starbucks was looking to expand, and he had non-compete clauses, so he was doing some work on sustainability with coffee in the United Nations. He was one of the co-founders of the Cup of Excellence Award, which maybe some of you have heard of. It's a country award for the best producers in each country. And he really sort of took what I knew about coffee to the next level. But the thing is,
What was that sound?
for as much as I knew about coffee as a consumer, I started to hit a wall, because clearly consumption on the consumption side is not the same as the production side. So I started to sort of get into understanding more. I had given 2 seminars at the Specialty Coffee Association, the SCA Expo, when it was held in Boston. One in 2019, that was sort of me combining my interest in consumer sustainability or indifference thereof. And then the other was in 2022, where after COVID or during COVID, I had bought we got a cat in 2019, just before COVID, and I didn't want a cat. And my family was adamant that we get a cat. And I said, fine, then I get to name it. And so I named it after a cooperative in Ethiopia. And when COVID hit, and we were all staying at home and making coffee at home, I ordered every single roaster in America where I could find that coffee. And I started to go into what was ordering that coffee teaching me about the value chain of coffee. And the SCA, the Specialty Coffee Association, had just released a new updated definition of specialty coffee. And I had major problems with it as an academic, because what else would we do as academics but critique things, debate things, et cetera, et cetera. So this was me sort of saying what I had learned about specialty coffee through ordering as a consumer. And again, how I sort of saw problems with specialty coffee, this new definition. And what's interesting about this new definition is coming here and talking to various actors in the value chain here on the production side. When we've asked people how would they define specialty coffee, everybody has almost a different answer, right? So they made this definition, it was blanket, wide, whatever, and nobody actually understands what specialty coffee is. We still don't have a definition of it. So I had done a lot of work on the consumption side. I mean, I hadn't done any work on the consumption side. I had a lot of interest, a lot of personal interest in it. It sort of had run in tangent with my research on sustainability, consumer welfare, marketplace justice. And then I made tenure almost 2 years ago, and I said, okay, now I'm going to sort of pivot the focus of my actual research stream to exclusively coffee. And so I was awarded tenure in the summer of 22. And then I started to look and I said, okay, I want to go down to actually research what things are like, because we have these ideas at the consumer point of view, and particularly in the United States and other consumption-led, consumption-dominant countries. What is it like at production? So aside from sort of pivoting the research stream itself, it was, I need to go down to a place that actually grows, produces coffee to be able to better understand this. So I put out a call on LinkedIn, because I was thinking about applying for a Fulbright to be able to get some grant that would help me come here for a sabbatical. It was my first post-tenure sabbatical, which is obviously why I've been here for 4 months without having to worry about classes, thankfully. My colleagues are now doing marking, and I don't miss that this semester. So I put out a call on LinkedIn looking for somebody who might actually be able to, put me in as a connection to Fulbright for sponsorship. And I had a colleague there's a movement in the Association for Consumer Research called Transformative Consumer Research. And this is research that is looking at how consumption can improve individual and collective well-being. And so I put something out and somebody had responded, one of the people that I knew from both the job market as well as from prior conferences and TCR conferences, introduced us through email, introduced me to Andres. And the funny thing was, I'm reading this thing and I'd never heard of him. And I was looking at his profile on the Uniandes website, and I realized that we had been at the same TCR conference 2 times, at least 2 times, and then a virtual one, 3 times. And the TCR conference is a dialogical conference where you basically meet for 2.5 days in a room on one particular topic, and you basically write a journal article on that. So we had been in completely different topics, completely different tracks in the conferences that we were at, but I had this understanding that he knew kind of the mindset that I was approaching this research with. And so even though we may have not come from the same, specific research track, that we would have a similarity. And that obviously, not obviously, but hopefully would have proved beneficial for doing the work that I was setting out to do while I was here. So from this introduction, started the whole process of applications for the Fulbright, applying for the sabbatical, because then I put in my sabbatical application that I was going to come here, awarded the sabbatical before I even found out that I was coming here on a Fulbright. So I sort of had a little bit of a big risk on taking my sabbatical, but yeah, it worked out really well. And obviously since January, I've been here working with Andres, and it's been a really memorable, pleasurable, productive experience, I think. And I hope for both of us. Okay, so that's a little bit about the background of me. So over the last 4 months, obviously, we've done quite a bit of data collection. We've got about 45 hours, probably even more now, I think, of recordings of various people across the value chain, various types of actors at different levels, whether it is entrepreneurs, whether it's roasters, whether it's buyers, and all of this is here on the production side. All of this is here in Colombia. So we're getting sort of all of the takeaways that, and the themes that I'll be talking about are going to be themes that are coming from here, not from the American or any other consumer dominant country. We have been to a number of cafes. I've been to a number of cafes, have observations around those, and obviously the Tinto carts, as well as 2 coffee tastings. And then this past weekend, we did a professional coffee tasting where we got sort of one last push of data gathering for this whole thing. And then field work. So in January, I was at a farm in Zipacon. In February, my family came for a week, and we vacationed for 2 days out to Armenia, and I took them to one of the farms in Salento. In March, Andres and I went to Neiva for a couple of days to go to farms there and speak with people in Neiva. And 2 weeks ago, we took another field work trip to Pitalito and spoke with some farmers in that area as well. So it was really an interesting experience for me, particularly to be able to see more of the country outside of the city, and as obviously get to be able to speak with various coffee professionals in the industry around the country, not, again, just here in the city. So a wide variety of experiences. This is like the couple of slides of what I did on my 4 months in Colombia. We did get one meeting with the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros de Colombia. That was when my family came, and they put us all in those nice tourist ponchos and hats. My son decided to buy one at the airport because he was so excited, and then he wore it to school. And yeah, anyways. So yeah, we had a wide variety of different experiences, I think, that lent itself to some good and rich data for our field work to add to the interviews. For example, here's I don't know if this will work. Yeah, I'm not going to show the whole clip, but we went to one of the farms outside of Huila, and not outside of Huila, outside of Neiva in Huila. And this gentleman had showed us some of his farms, some of the different varietals. We were, doing some observations of different coffee trees. And then it was interesting to me because not only was this a pivot for me to do research on coffee, but it was also a pivot for me to do qualitative research. And even in the process of putting this together, putting some of these themes together, it was recognizing how some of the most innocuous things you might see were potentially data. So we would be walking around and then have some idea and ask us some question of, what is this? What is this? How are people responding to this? And all of a sudden you get an answer that was longer, and then you'd have more information that you'd be working with. And so it was really interesting, again, for me to be able to see how this pivot, would go in terms of using qualitative data and collecting it as well. And then this was from our trip 2 weeks ago in Pitalito, where we saw more farms, got to go to a buying station. Some of the harvest was just starting, and we had seen some of the pickers as well. And so out of all of this data, we still have to curate it. Found several themes about how inequality is themes that sort of shape inequality in the coffee production market, particularly here in Colombia, where our data is obviously from. We have not really curated the data yet. We have not analyzed the data yet. This is all stuff that are themes that we've seen as we've looked sort of, and as we've been collecting the data that eventually are going to guide our academic output. And I don't know, industry folks, I think, are very interested in hearing this as well. So I'm excited to have some sort of impact on industry with these various themes. Okay. A little bit of background on marketing for those of you who aren't really marketing folk. This is sort of the take that I use looking at marketing. Marketing is exchange. Marketing, this was sort of the core of my doctoral work. And it was, like I said, I had looked at equity in exchange. And marketing essentially is value exchange. The idea that there are social resources, the idea that there are economic resources, and all of these resources are exchanged in the marketplace. And oftentimes that exchange is seen, or should be seen, as reciprocated. So there is a norm of reciprocity in marketing exchange. That norm, that reciprocity, we see in the relationship between benefits to costs. So value essentially is a relationship of benefits to costs. And what one person's costs becomes the other party's, the counterparty's benefits, and vice versa. So the value that is exchanged with that reciprocity creates these relationships over the longer term, which creates value, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, this value can be at an individual level, or it can be towards global stakeholders. So we see here a number of ways that one party's benefits, again, can become the other party's costs, and vice versa. Okay? Boghossian, in his initial work in the 1970s, had looked at exchange at a variety of both macro and micro levels as being complex, because it was not just one party having one particular specialization. You think about economics, the idea of the division of labor, the idea of specialization. These specializations occur and are fragmented throughout the marketplace. So therefore, this exchange becomes more complex as different parties are specializing. So out of that, this is one of my core theses, core for my thesis, was this concept of equity theory, which some people in management may be familiar with, in strategic management. Equity theory is a form of distributed justice that is exchanged in the market. In this case, it will be exchanged in the marketplace. Okay. It hadn't been a theory that had been dealt with at all in marketing, but yet, because marketing is about value exchange, seemed to make sense to me. It was logical to me. So even though it was a different context, even though it was a different discipline, I applied it in a different way to say that equity exchange, or looking at equity in exchange, is when individuals perceive they put the same amount into society as they do in the exchange, and they've received the same in terms of benefits. Now, obviously, this is not a whole dissertation defense, so I'm not getting into the whole market segmentation thing that I did and all of that. But the core of it is that value is that there is a perception of equity as part of exchange, and that drives the way that, and that motivates the way that people and actors behave in the marketplace. So that, to me, is the fundamental understanding of what equity is and how it's related to value in the marketplace. In the past year, the Specialty Coffee Association actually had put out a report that they had interviewed some various stakeholders and looked at value and equitable value distribution in the coffee chain. And you can see that there's this big gap, particularly on the farming side, of the value that's created versus the value that's distributed. Okay. Well, obviously, this has massive implications, particularly when you consider the fact that a lot of consumption is not producing, right? So some people call the global north, some people call the global south. I've started to prefer net consumption dominant versus net production dominant, because it's not always about north or south where the production and consumption is. There may be a correlation, but it's not necessarily causal, right? So we look at this and we see there that particularly on the production side, there's a big gap. Yeah. Yeah. This is the SCA did a survey of farmers and roasters and a whole bunch of people, and that's where their data came from. I personally, I looked at the report more fully, and I think there's still some methodological. I don't think that it was truly, I mean, it was not really an academic report, but that's where the data came from.
So they were asking questions about
yeah,
perception of how much value each step is.
Exactly.
And what do they mean by distribution?
What is coming back? Usually it's monetarily. Like what are the returns?
Okay.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And actually that was one of the points that I had asked. So they had done a webinar on this report, and I looked at it and I asked them, well, how do you define it? Is it just money that's being yeah, well, to me, I would look at it more broadly, because there's other ways that the value distribution could be, other things of value that could be distributed. But again, that was kind of at a, yeah. Okay.
We can't hear the questions.
Right.
And so does this create a value with respect to coffee industry?
Yeah. I mean, they didn't really, that's another thing. And that's where I sort of have been, I think there is an element where terms and definitions matter. And I think that there are elements, particularly in and as we've been doing this work, where I think that there are, and of course, as academics, we do this all the time, we come up with new definitions and new constructs and new ways. I do think that there are elements of that, of what you just said, where if we redefine them, or we define them more specifically, for example, or more precisely, for example, I don't know that that changes things as in total, but I do think that it has an effect on the way we perceive and talk about these types of issues. And I think that was a big one for me, was to say, okay, well, look, and I think we've discussed this before, you and I, the idea of like India producing coffee, but also consuming coffee. China produces coffee in Yunnan province, but also consuming coffee. Lucan brand is one of the biggest. They're opening like 15 stores a day in China. So the idea of North and South becomes very, to me, a tenuous sort of term to use. But the thing after coming up with new terms is getting them out there and other people understanding them and getting them to use it. And I've only just sort of took that bull by the horns. Right. Right. Yeah, no, 100%. And that's the thing about this is this is over the entire industry. So, I mean, if we broke it down, again, I don't know how these perceptions would ultimately be. But again, I also think there are some flaws in the methods that they used, and that's a whole other ball of wax. Okay, so out of this, we have come up with 7 themes, emergent themes in the coffee value system inequity. Okay, and there they are, and I'm going to go through each of these. Yeah. I'm looking, what was it? What's my time? I got an hour less. What? Yeah. You know, you give an act. I said when I was putting these together, I said I had like 70 slides for an hour, for a 4-hour presentation in an hour and a half. You know, it's a total academic. Okay. This first one, risk, choice, and the widening equity gap between production, which is the C price, or we're talking about the C price, and consumption, which is the SCA scores. Okay, I don't know how many of you are familiar with those terms, so get into these now. Production.
No.
Coffee production is often, particularly on the commodity market, paid by something what's called the C price, or the pricing is set by what's called the C price. The C price is a benchmark price that is set on the Intercontinental Exchange in New York as a futures contract for delivery of what basically is a container of green Arabica coffee. Okay. This price is primarily set by production. A little bit has to do with risk, supply, and demand. You may have seen in the last couple of weeks that the cacao markets have gone through the roof in their own benchmark price on the ICE exchange. Well, that's redundant. On the ICE, the Intercontinental Exchange. There's some sensitivity to demand. And even this morning, I was seeing some articles about how the price of coffee, and when they talk about the price of coffee, they're usually talking about this C price, about how the price of coffee is going to potentially soar in the next year because there's been some not enough demand. Or there's too much demand. Farmers are stockpiling their coffee, particularly because, as I know, a couple months ago, Yanina Grabs was talking about how the EUDR deforestation regulations were going to change, and there was going to be uncertainty about the shipments of coffee there. So there is a lot of volatility because it's basically saying you're trading on coffee, and it goes with the volatility in pricing that any asset that's traded on the market would otherwise see. Often it hovers around $2 a pound. Today it was about $2.30 a pound. About a week ago it was $2.50 a pound. And then again, as I mentioned before, 15 years ago, I would have looked at something like fair trade and said, okay, well, fair trade is the solution because fair trade is a minimum of $1.80 a pound. So if the cost of production goes down, then fair trade will boost up the price, and then you get this 20 cents a pound premium, and then there's another premium if your coffee is organic, and so forth. And over the last 15 years, I've found that it's not necessarily the case. There are times when fair trade is effective for farmers based on this price, and times when it's not. So we have this as one of the leading benchmarks of coffee pricing. And obviously, as a benchmark to the entire industry, some of which is commodity, most of which is commodity, a good chunk of which is not, that ends up leading to particular issues of inequity itself. Okay. Here's I think the screen grabs Thursday or something, and you can see for the last 30 years, the volatility, particularly around COVID, particularly now around these recent price shocks in the commodities markets. Again, if you're treating it as a commodity and you're using that and you're pricing that commodity based on futures, then, you know,
Yes,
you
two
have a
logos.
lot of this volatility that comes back to the
There's
farmers.
two logos
And
on
that
this shirt.
obviously,
You
when
know,
we're,
some
it's easy to be
Universidad de
abstract
Alcalde,
about it when you live in
and
the
you
United
announce-
States and you're not having to worry about what's going on in the actual lives of farmers and how this is impacting their day to day. This was a little bit, this was the last almost 5 years, and you can see and you can see it was really interesting even when I got here to see how it was about $1.80 a pound when I arrived in January, and it broke almost $2.50 a pound in this month. So obviously this volatility is going to shape and make things very risky for farmers, particularly in the commodity market, particularly farmers who are farming commodity coffee. 2020 Solidaridad Network did some calculations. They did some surveys of various farmers, and they were looking at how much the cost of production of an arroba of green coffee was. And when I calculated this out and translated this was about $2.64 a pound. Obviously, $2.64 a pound is going to be much higher than even the C price is. So where does that leave the farmers, right? If the price is being set by the futures exchanges and that price is going to be lower than this, then farmers are essentially going to be taking a loss. Again, it depends on where the volatility of the market is. So we can contrast that price on this production side with the value, or that value as it's paid out on the production side, with the value on the consumer side. Okay, particularly in the specialty coffee industry, we see that this is reflected by what's called the SCA cupping score. The SCA cupping score, much like wine, assigns a point value to the coffee. It assigns a score out of 100 points. And different buyers provide different prices based on demand, based on supply, based on the price, based on the what the cup score is. But even though these buyers are setting their own terms for their prices, they're oftentimes doing so referencing the C price. So if the C price goes up, and this is a premium cup of coffee, this is a higher specialty coffee, the price is going up. If the price goes down, well, they might not go down as fast, but they're still going to want to be competitive. This is primarily set by consumption. It's primarily set by what the point value is, what the point score is for the coffee. So where does this point score come from, so to speak? Well, it comes from selling consumers on the idea of helping farmers. It comes from boosting the idea that higher points, higher quality, and therefore costs more, and therefore getting consumers' price sensitivity to increase. And it really puts the bulk of the choice in this whole value chain in the hands of the consumers. So
this score is not about the taste or
it is. It is.
So how does
Oh, that he's wearing a sport jacket.
Yes,
Nance.
there is, and I've got this. This is actually this form ties to 3 of the themes that we've got here. And basically, so I was trying to figure out which slides to put it in. There is basically a form, and it has a variety of different dimensions, and those dimensions they go through, they cup the coffee, they tick it off, and each of those things has points, and then they add it up, and that's what the score is. And as we'll get into in one of the other themes, there is a sort of a objectifying of subjective tastes, and B, those are point estimates, essentially. And so, you know, you could have, and what you'll see on this, I know I've got it actually on that, I've got this coming back up on that, and it is a little bit bigger, I cropped it, but what you see is a half a point or 1 point could lead to 200,000 pesos difference per carga, per bag of green coffee. just 1 point. So those things end up making a significant difference in the way that the coffee is value is distributed. So, right. So consumers have this choice, have a lot of choices. One of the things that I found very interesting when I came here was noticing that all of the coffee here in Colombia is Colombian coffee. In the US, I can go, this is a roaster from New Orleans, and I go and I want to shop from them or go to the cafe. There's Colombia, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, another. We've got coffees from all over the world. And as a consumer, I have my choice of any of these things. What's interesting is that many of the farmers don't even necessarily realize that they're competing with the entire world when putting their coffee up to market. And that's huge. Because again, I can't buy anything here other than Colombian coffee. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does indicate how in net consumption dominant countries, there are more choices which reflect the way that the value chain can otherwise be skewed. And I'll get to that, and that has a factor in another moment. So we see here this value chain where going from producers to exporters to all the way to consumers, and there are other actors sort of related, integrally related, but outside the actual chain itself. Cooperatives or associations, for example, where the farmers, the producers bring the coffee to, and maybe the farmers, they'll get some sort of roasting out of that as part of their membership in the cooperative. They may get different terms of sale, et cetera, all the way to the gear people that create drippers and machines, and we'll come back to that a little bit. All of these have some element of value. And the thing is as coffee moves through this value chain, value is continuously added up until the very end, up until the consumer. Okay. But the thing is that everybody in this value chain that we've taught, when we talk to them, thinks that they're doing more than the next person. So what we've seen or what we've heard is as coffee progresses along the value chain, there's this idea that perceived risk for each actor is almost exponentially increasing. So what we see is that each actor is almost giving is buying on a multiple of the next one. So the producer is making 2 million per carga, and then we see the exporter, they'll do it 2 times, 2x, importer will be 4x, the roaster will be 10x, and then the consumer is paying 13 times the price of the producer. Why? Because everybody is saying that they've got the same amount, that everybody perceives that they've taken on more risk in the process of adding value than the last person, than the last actor. I don't necessarily think that that's the case. I mean, we'll talk in a bit about farmers risking planting certain varieties that are on trend on their farms. To risk. If their coffee doesn't grow right, they're left holding the bag. They're left with all of the risk. So saying that one person's risk is more important than the others becomes a bit of a problem when we're talking about equity in this chain. Let's go the other way, from the consumer backwards to the producer, because I do think that there is an element of framing issue as well that works here. If we look back at the consumer and we look at this as a function of choice and the ability to make choices, well, this goes the other way. Right? Consumers have a ton of choice, and then the producers, the choices that they make, or at least the agency they have in making those choices, becomes much more restricted. They may have choices, but not really good ones. What does this imply about equity? Everyone assumes no one has equal risk, and then consequently, in the absence of any market transparency, which is something we'll talk about next, no one prices the value of that risk equally. So when we go from consumers who have a high choice and ability to make set prices to the producers who have lower choice and lower ability to make prices, then that widens the gap. That has a reduced ability and instead accelerates or exacerbates the inequity. So we're looking at this juxtaposition of risks and assumed risks and perceived risks versus choice and the ability to actually make choices and take risks or not.
Sorry, I'm just curious that seems to me here that we may have like a legal challenge. But moreover, for instance, Federación de Cafeteros de Colombia is supposed to represent the producer. But I'm not sure that they're doing their work properly because they're supposed to be like a robust barrier towards this exacerbation of inequity.
Yes.
But apparently they're not doing it.
Yes.
Because for them it's probably not convenient.
Yes. Yes.
Kind of absurd.
Yes.
From yeah, I know that I shouldn't invest in coffee then.
No, no, you make a point. No, this is something that
Instrument that work towards this. But then a legal instrument might be seen also as something not so liberal.
yes.
Control the economy, which is not good.
And so there has been, and this has been one of the tricky things, and certainly we've talked about your point, well, all 4 months with a lot of coffee. Because one way of resolving that would be to have something structural in place, which ostensibly would be the Federation. Now, even before not before the Federation, but before we were talking about this, from I think it was the 40s through basically 1992, there was an international coffee agreement from the International Coffee Organization. And the ICA essentially set price quotas and export quotas for globally. And there are several people that I've talked to on the consumer side who've looked at it and said, if we had those controls now, globally, there would be more equity in the market than there currently is. The problem with that is you trade off a variety of things, such as the interest in then making a market that is specialized, right? People would say, well, it was really the collapse of the ICA that allowed specialty coffee to flourish because then farmers would be incentivized to grow better coffee and then export that coffee, et cetera, et cetera. So you're right. There is a huge question about how do you deal with this, what you just said, and then if it's not on a global level, then yeah, what is the role of the Federation? And that is I'll come back to that. That's on the last slide. Is the big question for us is.
Last week I was checking rights. Also, there's something happening there that in the government.
Yes.
Differently towards what is the solution.
Yeah, we've had some extensive conversations with among us and with some of the people that we had interviewed around that. We spoke with them. We've spoke with one of the people in Huila as well who worked for the Federation, and that was a huge challenge for us to figure it out. And I don't think we have no answer. We have no answer. But you're absolutely right. It does beg the question of shouldn't they be doing it? Okay, so that's the first one.
You're not gonna get through all this, Spencer.
It is either the commodity usually is going off of the C price, And the Federation, I mean, that's one of the things they do is they post every day on the website and they send out in an email what the C price is. And the Federation otherwise will say that they are a buyer of last resort. And so if anybody has washed coffee that they can't sell, that they are, and there's another risk that they will say, we're assuming risk by being that buyer of last resort. Usually that's the commodity take. The other take is the specialty buyer's take, which would be, we're going to evaluate what the C price is, what supply and demand is from the roasters, because we're dealing directly instead of commodity basis. And we've got this. And what's interesting, and this will come back, they're all intertwined. All these themes are intertwined somehow. And we'll come back to this and say there's an informal knowledge transfer among producers where they will send on a WhatsApp group all of the prices from the different buyers locally, and they will see what the local and who's got the best price, et cetera, et cetera. And that was kind of interesting because it was like, we didn't know how they were knowing what the prices were, but they were sharing it among themselves to see who's buying at what price. And that price is set by the buying station in terms of, like I said, supply, demand, interest, from et cetera. Okay, the second one is about information asymmetry. This one deals a lot with the idea of information transparency, but also the reciprocity of information exchange. So when we look at information, we think of information as flowing two ways, both upstream from production and downstream from the consumers or to the consumers. But oftentimes in the coffee industry, as with many commodity markets, is asymmetric. In the specialty coffee industry, we see a lot of these demands on producers, on producers. I can't even speak English. To start providing transparency and traceability. And these things require time, they require labor, they require capital. One of these things is, for example, is blockchain technology. We see people wanting to say, oh, well, the issue with information traceability could be solved with blockchain. Well, that's a database that costs money to run, that costs money to train people to put and enter the information into. And when we're looking particularly at coffee production, that is both time and money that many farmers, many producers don't have. And these demands are otherwise being put on these producers to come up with some sort of solution for that. And again, this was sort of what Yanina was talking about back in March with the EUDR regulations, the deforestation regulations, is whose onus is it to get that information, and whose time, money, labor, capital is being spent on that? Is it the farmers? We also see this with explaining narratives, explaining the story of the farmers. We see roasters that want, create us a video, create for us a video, create something that we can put on YouTube to explain your farm, and that will help us sell your coffee better. Again, time, money, etc. Often this is not given any additional compensation into the cost of production. Or the fact that information has economic value. So we see this is a roaster in Denver, and they've put on their website that that we can meet this producer's family, and they have this whole story about what this producer is about, and that they put the things in the competition, and he's got he's turning over the farm to his 4 children, and all of this nice story that's supposed to help sell the coffee. And included in that is their transparency information about their relationship with this farmer. Again, how do we establish relationships? Well, that's a whole other, we didn't get into that. They're putting all of this on their website in theory to sell the coffee, but what does that actually mean? Same thing with blockchain technology. There's a company called Farmer Connect, and they were going to be able to show you, and you can go and use a QR code and see all of the information. And what does that actually mean? All of that processing of all of that information has to be done by somebody whose time and labor is going to be a function of that. But they're not getting anything back in most instances for doing this. It's not necessarily equating to a better price for their coffee. It's not something that was back here on the pricing board. Here's what your information is worth. Here's what your time was worth. The idea is that this will help us sell your coffee, and therefore it's a better, you know, it's good that you give us all of this information. Buyers, we were looking at this from the market for lemons sort of standpoint. And the market for lemons, for anybody who's not know, the Nobel Prize winning work by Akerlof, sellers generally have more information than buyers in an exchange. And they look at this, and I had to explain this to Andres, this concept of what the lemons was. So, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with the market for lemons. Okay, so some yes, most more no, some okay, mixed. Okay, quickly, basically this is about cars, not lemons. The idea was that especially used cars. The idea was that used cars, that the buyer, that the car lot, that the salespeople knew more about the condition and how bad that used car was. And therefore, they could leverage what they knew about that car and how bad that car was when reselling to a consumer who knew nothing about the quality or long-term, you know, reliability of that car. And in the US, the term for a used car that is bad is called a lemon. And so the idea, we have what's called lemon laws, where if buying a car and it doesn't work with, or things happen or whatever, you have X period of time, and all the states have lemon laws because they know that the buyer is advantaged in the amount of information they have about that used car. We were looking at this in reverse, particularly when you look at this from a sort of a post-colonial perspective. The buyers have more information than the sellers. The buyers understand the consumers better. The buyers understand the gear people better. The buyers are basically in control in this instance. So the buyer's risk is reduced, going back to the previous slide. Right? We perceive that consumers have more risk, but they don't necessarily have more risk because they have more choice. The second thing is that information is an asset. In other words, it has value in marketing exchange. And I think that there's no better, no better adage to explain that than the term big data is the new oil. Right? We've heard that one, but we've heard that one before, right? Why? Because there is an economic value to having information. Now, the value of information dissipates over time, but it does have that economic value. So why is it not being priced as part of the value? If it's being demanded or asked for, why is that not being put into the value exchange? Information as a service is treated as inseparable from the product, so therefore this becomes a form of marketplace extraction. There is one producer I spoke to several years ago in Hawaii who created a blockchain for his own farm, and he was therefore putting the data onto the blockchain. And what he was doing was, depending on what stage, whether it was coffee cherries or parchment or pergamino or green, he could sell the data with the coffee. This is what the coffee is. This is what the data is valued at. This is what the coffee is. This is what the data is valued at. And he had all of that. So he was willfully pricing the value of the data into the coffee that he was selling. But I don't think we really are seeing that as a widespread solution in this industry. So what do we see? Well, what we see is that information imperialism is pulling this information out, it's extracting out from the producers, and it's not being reciprocated as normally we would understand in value exchange. Right? Value exchange, particularly marketplace exchange, has this norm of reciprocity. We're not seeing it. And that's another place where there's inequity in this value chain. Again, looking at this from a complex exchange, what we would ideally see is a two-way flow of information. Now, and not just here, but each place. And I could put more arrows going to all the other places as well, because everybody should be able to see it, but they don't. It's generally asymmetric. So the producers that we've talked to have said, well, where's reverse traceability? Okay, if we're not going to get something economically for it, then give us other data. Give us the reverse. Make it reciprocal. Where is the coffee being sold? To whom? How much is being paid to the green buyer? How much is the buyer paying other actors? Are they paying for thousands, hundreds of dollars to have a booth at Scott to be able to sell the coffee, for example? And we've seen some voluntary or self-reported data in the Specialty Coffee Transaction Guide, which is led by Professor Peter Roberts at Emory University in Atlanta. But it is self-reported and it's voluntary. So obviously it's going to have its own challenges. And yet, right now, producers are saying this is the best we've got. This is the best. This is this past year. You can see it's like a 60-page report, shows all of the data that they are given and how they tabulated and all of that. This is the best they've got. And it's still relatively limited. And again, it's still self-report, voluntary. Etiquette. Yes.
So the farmer will get the information and government on one person to use that information comes from, you have this federation, you have these.
Yeah, I mean, you could make that argument, but again, it's like everything. It's the question of how do you centralize policy and structure versus how do you give people the choice to do what they are going to otherwise be doing. And then combining that with coffee's history of colonialism and the way that those power imbalances have otherwise worked in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we see, for example, a market for specialty rice or specialty wheat. So we've treated coffee, we have a consumer market that treats coffee less like a commodity, particularly now, than we do other types of commodity markets. We see it grow. We've seen it grown in cacao. We've seen it grown somewhat in tea, but other commodity markets, not really in the consumer side. Teas, there are a lot of coffee and tea have a lot of similarities to this market. All right, that's two. Okay, the third one is about taste regimes and post-colonialism formalizing taste objectivity. So that roaster in Denver has given us this whole thing about where the coffee comes from, and they give us their brew recipes for it on pour over, on espresso, et cetera, et cetera. They're telling the consumer how to make the coffee, how to prepare the coffee. Well, one of the things that I found interesting, this photo is, I don't know about you, but this one was extremely meaningful to me. It seems like nothing, right? It's a coffee sapling. And we're on this farm, and I look at this, and I see this, and I take this photo, and the farmer I think you were asking about, well, what was it? And the farmer was telling us that there's this new variety of coffee called Obligón. And this sapling is an Obligón sapling. And I know quite a few varieties and had never heard of this variety. So we're on the farm and I'm looking up what is Obligón coffee. And this is back in the consumption side, this blog called Perfect Daily Grind, which is all coffee news type of stuff. And this article is in August of 2023 talking about what Obligón coffee is and could it be more popular, and basically that it's being used by barista champions and all of this type of stuff. So it's becoming this trendy variety of coffee. So I go back and I'm looking back at this and we're walking around a little bit more, and I come back to this and I asked the farmer, I said, well, who's responsible? Like, how did you end up getting to this point of putting this on your farm? It's not a widely known variety. I didn't even know it. And he said, well, the roaster, who's not in Colombia, I think it was, I don't remember, it was in Europe or Europe or the US. I can't remember. Almost doesn't matter. Asked him to do it. Asked him to grow this, which begs its own question. You know, the roaster's over here and he's asking the producer to plant and harvest and all of these things, the coffee that he wants. What is that implying about who gets to dictate the terms of taste? So you mentioned the cupping form, right? So the cupping form was redone recently. Yeah. No. What was it? It only grows in wheel, but I don't know. I don't remember who developed it. Yeah. There are a couple of varieties now that are being Papaya is another one that are trendy, that are growing in southern Huila, but I don't know who developed them. It's not the Federation, no. Robust.
No, but of the seeds, yeah, you can.
Yeah, the seeds.
I think the Federation has developed their own seeds that are like special for the Colombian pests against Colombian pests. And things like that.
Right, and one of the reasons that the Federation isn't interested in this is because it's not developed by them. So there's a concern about risk, for example. Again, the Federation is not necessarily wanting to take the risk of crops that may or may not be broker resistant or rust resistant or fungus resistant. So that's another risk that farmers end up taking when they're planting these varieties. And that's the thing, is they're planting these varieties with a lot of risk assumed by them, hoping that they're going to be making more money. But if the harvest doesn't work out, they're the ones that are left holding what it is, in contrast with the roaster, who basically can cut his loss. So this is the cupping form that SCA uses to evaluate. You sit at the cupping table, you have the five cups for each one, and then you evaluate it and you score it, and there's this whole thing that goes. And who is it created by? Okay. Well, first of all, let's talk about what a taste regime is. A good colleague, Zainab Barcel at Concordia University, said in a couple of papers of hers that it's a discursively constructive normative system that orchestrates practice in an aesthetically oriented culture of consumption. In other words, these taste regimes are these systems of aesthetics in consumption. So who gets to define them? Well, in the case of coffee, let's go back for a second for the history of SCA. This was about 2017, 2016, a merger of the Specialty Coffee Association of America and the Specialty Coffee Association of Europe. Well, the US and Europe represent this, what? A defining taste. Right? They're creating, this organization is creating this form that's being used at the cupping tables down here in Colombia, in Honduras, in Ethiopia, and is all that's being defined by an organization that's effectively been the merger of an American and European organization. Who gets to define taste? So we're down in Huila, we're at the sensory analysis lab at Universidad Colombiana, and they're analyzing coffee for local farmers there. And this is the SCA flavor wheel. Okay. And this is designed by, I think it's UC Davis and Zurich, I think, the university there, and it's trying to define all of these flavor components. And they put this in this wheel, and it's been updated a couple of times. And this is hanging, you know, most people in the coffee industry know the wheel. And this wheel is hanging up on the lab. And I looked at Andres and I said, where is Lulo on this wheel? Okay. Lulo is a fruit that I had never heard of before I came here 4 months ago. Why? Because it damages, so it never makes it to the US. And yet, having had it, I would describe it, as partially lemony, partially tart cranberry, sort of. I have a better understanding, a better reference of that taste. And yet, it's not on the wheel. Why? Because who's the wheel developed by? So when we were talking about this in the cupping on Saturday, when you're tasting things, you're having here in Colombia, you're having to reevaluate what it is you're tasting in a way that makes sense to, say, Americans or Europeans, because that's the wheel. You're now having to define the taste of lulo according to this, not according to Colombian tastes. So who is empowered to construct taste then? And more so, who does it benefit? Who does that power benefit? Okay. Well, given the relationship between SCA and the cupping and the flavor wheel and the pricing, which is informed by the flavor wheel and by the cupping score, how does post-colonial imposition of taste regime influence producer equity? Again, if we see the cupping form, for example, you're a 0.5 point difference, and that makes 200,000 pesos per carga. That could make a huge difference. And again, as mentioned, it's sort of a point estimate. You're going around, you're cupping, you're scoring it, and that's what it is. And I could go tomorrow and sort of feel a little bit differently about it. And that 0.5 point difference make a huge difference in the equity terms. And where is it being set? By the US, by an organization that comes out of US and Europe. The fourth one, this one we have a lot less on, but did not want to be remiss in discussing it. I think we would still like to do more work on this, is looking at the pickers, looking at the people who are actually harvesting the coffee. And this one is short, so that's good because I'm running out of time. Much of coffee's labor force is based off of transitory migrant labor. And a lot of it is domestic, although obviously there are a lot more Venezuelans coming into being a part of that labor force as well. But what is the role of this labor force on both commodity and specialty coffee? Particularly, how do you balance quality and taste with a transitory workforce? Okay. For producers, the pickers are almost 1/3 of the production costs. So a sizable element of that is going towards the people picking the coffee. And again, that requires understanding the tastes, being able to spot the exact red ones, the ripe ones, and making sure that, so there's a whole element of who and how that, who is getting and who is making what from these pickers. From the job that the pickers are doing. Okay, that was a shorter one. It was a shorter one, but not least important. I think it's just one that we had challenges with because, first of all, it was not harvest season, so we had difficult time seeing people out in the farms doing the picking. Also, I don't speak enough Spanish. Speak barely enough Spanish. To be able to get access to having conversations with pickers to find out more of them. But I think it's something that certainly from an equity standpoint interests me. Okay, the fourth one is about the informal transfer of producer knowledge in production markets. And we were talking a little bit before about the coffee farmers sharing the prices in the WhatsApp groups. We find a lot of the farmers got into specialty coffee because they went to their association or they went to a co-op and they heard that so-and-so farmer was making more per carga than they were by growing specialty coffee. And so they're learning a lot that is informal as opposed to formal education about business, formal education about the industry. It's all through experience. Many of the farmers hadn't even cupped their own coffee, haven't even tasted their own coffee. They don't even know where it is. We talked with one producer who basically had his dad's coffee cupped and realized that it was good, really good, and that if they could, make some improvements, they could make it even better and make more money. And so they sent it out to a sensory analysis lab to find out exactly how good it was and be able to start making adjustments in their growing processes. Much of this is done informally because there is no structured way of communicating knowledge to the farmers to be able to understand these concepts. So if we look at this from an actor network theory perspective, we can say that some of this is because the types of information flows between the producers are not necessarily symmetric. There's disconnect. When you're living 3, 4, 10 kilometers from your neighbor's farm, it's harder to get that information until you go to the co-op or until you go to the association to be able to share that information. Some farmers have realized that social media can be a benefit to bridge that gap, sharing information amongst themselves, communicating directly with producers. But again, that requires a more sophisticated understanding of social media and how to use it and how best to use it. The Federation is sort of getting better with this. They've put this up on Instagram. They've got this, I think was the main account. They've got an account for Senate Cafe to be able to share knowledge about production. But we also see this, again, with this informal transfer of pricing boards being shared in WhatsApp groups. Yes. Talk more.
Well, this is very good. I guess we needed more time.
We need more.
To reach the discussion. However, I was here thinking that my guess is that 90% of the coffee of the planet was produced by about 10 countries, maybe?
Good amount, yeah. Brazil, Vietnam, and Colombia are the top 3.
Okay, so have you heard about an idea of a cartel, like countries becoming like trying
No.
to protect the markets somehow, like the OPEC did in the 70s?
No, the ICO would have been doing that, but since the agreement collapsed in '92, they don't do much. I don't know what they do.
Because a lot of the reflections that you're doing for me, they always go back to the Federation. Like the Federation should be doing something about it, but maybe the Federation does not.
You know what? I'm going to skip ahead. I'm going to skip ahead to the part where we say, what is the long-term role of the Federation in establishing long-term equitability?
Other countries, it won't do anything.
Right.
However, if the federations get into an agreement, maybe they can have a position to confront the importers.
Right.
That's what I mean.
Right. Yeah, that's something, right. That would be a sort of a rational way of, I think, of looking at it. I think there's a lot of competition in the market that there is not that rationality of looking at it, particularly from a country to country level, because everybody wants to say, well, we do this, we do this, we do this. Oh, 100%. Because people would say, because Guatemala has a version of it, and they're one of the only other countries that have a federation similar to this Ana Cafe. And people would say, and we've heard mixed reviews on them as well, in terms of it's great, it's better than the Federación. And then one said, no, it's worse than it because they don't. And so everybody is competing even in their own way of thinking about structuring it domestically, let alone organized globally. And there are so many countries that are growing coffee, way more than like an OPEC, for example. Right. And then there's
Not run by the government. That's why they're fighting. First, second, a lot of countries has destroyed the federation. There's no more federation. Guatemala and Colombia, the only ones that remain. They're on the street.
Free. Everybody's free.
Everybody.
Yes.
To do that. So that is one of the issues around putting so much further power in the federation. And again, the federation is focused on commodity volume.
right.
Not specialty volume, which is volume.
And that's a trade-off we haven't even talked about here is the fact that Brazil is scale. So they do a lot more commodity, but most of the farmers have recognized that commodity on scale is not necessarily achievable here. So instead, let's focus on quality. So the impetus is to go to higher priced specialty coffee here more than it is in Brazil. They're one of the biggest in Robusta, but more so because they have lower. A lot of their varieties are designed for, or designed, grown, bred, whatever, for lower elevation, flatter lands, and they can use machinery to harvest. Okay, yeah, I'm gonna. That's it. that.
You as a support, how, from what you saw, what is the quality of living of producers here? What did you see? Do you think they have good quality of life? Did you see that they started precarious quality of life? What did you see from your perspective?
It's very heterogeneous.
You saw differences.
I'll take, for example, the one I saw in Zipacone. They have glamping. Glamping. Glamorous camping.
Literally.
Yeah. To tourism, yeah. But there's even a mix on that. There's even a mix on like, oh, well, I'm going to do tourism stuff. And then you look at one and then you look at the other and you're like, these people have money to put into these cabins and whatnot. And these people are trying to do something, but don't know that it's not working. And we've seen some of that too. It's like they're trying, but they don't know the response, like what the response is from Americans, for example, who are coming down for tourism and looking at that saying, well, that one doesn't really have the water, running water.
For local.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's the thing is, I think there's a lot of heterogeneity in the industry. And that's the challenge of the inequity is how do you allow people to still do what they want to be able to do without, you know, constraining them, but also make things more equitable for everyone. So, yeah, I would like to thank all of you, well, and who's still 90 seconds for coming, yeah, for being gracious hosts, to Andres for working with me over the last 4 months. You know, I really could not have done it without him, both from a contextual perspective, but also from, you know, having a good collaborator to work with and also do interpretations during interviews and things like that. And also Felipe in the marketing area here for hosting me. It's definitely been, I'm taking a lot from this. Thank you.